How's it going, my peeps? I'm going to try to make this video relatively short, but it probably won't be. I wanted to talk about the global food supply without getting into some dark, dreary, premonition of the future. Since I was born, the world's population has almost doubled. If you have ever looked at the population explosions, the chart that shows exactly how many people were on Earth, to put it in perspective, when this country was founded, there was 0.7 billion people on Earth. Now there's about 7 billion people on Earth. What that means is that from the time this country was founded until now, the world population has multiplied by 10. That is no small change, and it's hard for us to gauge that much intensity and that much reproduction over such a short period of time. But the Industrial Revolution gave us longer lives, better medicine, and more children. So much of this happened during the baby boomer generation, of course, and it's just continued to climb. I wanted to talk for a minute about food and how much food we actually have on this planet. I've learned some facts and figures that were not surprising, but a little bit discouraging. For example, the food that we waste on Earth is about, they say, 1.6 billion tons per year. So if you do the math, it comes out to 250 to 300 pounds of food per person on Earth per year that is wasted. So we're talking about a pound a day of food for every man, woman, and child is wasted. And that's just what's wasted daily because of blemishes, imperfections, or government mandates which force farmers to dump their product in order to keep the prices high. There are so many concerns that it's almost impossible to gauge how to deal with it. And so if the price is too high in one area, like there was a bunch of farmers who had to dump millions of pounds of tart cherries out because there is what you might call the cherry mafia, a group of people who want to keep the prices set. So basically, farmers in the U.S. were forced to dump their own cherries in order and then they were importing cherries to fill some of these slots. In other words, there's a lot of backroom deals that go on which affect huge market issues within the commodities. Also, then there's tariffs on other countries and how it hurts the U.S. farmers because now they can't export their wheat, or they can't export their soybeans, or they can't import certain things. So tariffs, regulations, rules are keeping people from getting fed, but it's more than that. The idea is that they say we're going to need to double the food supply by the year 2050. And to try to, when we think about farms, we think, well, we're doing the best we can, we're making as much food as we can. This is true to an extent, but biofuels, for example, as much as we're trying to, help the environment by creating these biofuels, they were apparently responsible for 20 to 40% of the 2008 price hikes on food, because so much of the corn is being used and diverted to biodiesel, and a lot of other arable farmland is being used to grow plants that are non-food commodities. Well, one of the things is that we have enough food right now. Apparently, statistically, we have enough food and enough farmland on Earth to feed 10 billion people. And since we have 7 billion people, it's not a matter of having enough food. It's a matter of getting it from point A to point B. 70% of the hungry 70% of the people who go hungry live in rural and farm areas. And many of these make it very difficult for them to, this doesn't even include drought and the way that the farmlands are changing right now. We're losing a lot of arable farmland too. And plus to poor farming practices when the topsoil just blows away. But then also the greed creeps in. There's these big companies who go into these smaller nations and say, hey, let us control your food supply. Here, use our Monsanto seeds. And, I'm not going to bring the GMOs into this because it's a huge issue. There are some people who think the only way we're going to solve the problem and to make enough food is to use GMOs. And others who say it's going to completely destroy the food line. It's in, it's my belief that basically we have modified these plants over a long period of time, but we haven't modified them by splicing genes, and I think that that's a very slippery slope. But it also might save our ass, and I can't say one way or another how it's going to pan out in the end. If we have drought-tolerant corn or rice that can grow in, with less water, or a variety of different plants which might help us, it might also kill us. We just don't know. So that's for a totally different discussion. But one of the issues is there's a lot of land grabs and forcing farmers out in their own nations where they're already struggling and having a hard time feeding themselves. I mean, we can't even feed everyone in our own country. Even though the food's available, sometimes it's more difficult to get it from point A to point B. And Americans have this blemish-free produce issue, which is farmers, they say, throw away 25% or more of the food. The idea is that in this nation alone, 50% of the food gets wasted. Worldwide, it's 1/3. And this includes every aspect from farming to the table to throwing away your leftovers. But up to 25% or more of crops will just be dumped out in the field because they're imperfect. This includes squashes, melons. Perhaps there was a slight drought for a couple weeks and it caused a little imperfection on the top. And then the stores won't take it. Nobody will buy it. And the stores are allowed to, if they have too much, they can just send it back to the farmer and the farmer eats the cost. So we need to change a lot of the way we do business, all the way down to the consumer, who needs to learn that we have to pay a little more for good food, and I think we're starting to figure that out. But they say that if we'd have to put $83 billion a year into agriculture every year, up until 2050, in order to have enough food. 83 billion a year is just nothing. Just nothing. It's such a small amount of money that compared to the needs that we have, that it's preposterous that we're not even taking it as seriously as we should. But so I've thought about, perhaps you could use indoor grow operations in huge facilities in areas with geothermal power, say in Greenland, maybe or in Iceland, let's say, where there's a lot of geothermal activity. Find an area where you can use that heat to produce light, have giant warehouses for growing food. The thing is that you have to get that to the people who need it. The areas with the biggest populations need to have food that's accessible, and that's going to get harder and harder as the oceans rise, as the climate changes one way or another, as people are forced out of their homes from more intense weather and larger populations, wars. It's a crazy world out there. So I have just 7 things written down here because it's like, what do you do? What's the solution to the problem? There isn't one. It's huge. But to keep it simple, first one would be reduce waste. And that means better storage, because in other countries, it's often not an issue of having enough food. They can farm enough food, but then they can't store it. There's no way to properly preserve it or dry it for long-term use, and so they end up with a lot of waste. So helping come up with better methods of storage for these, especially places that need it, without coming in and taking over somebody's water well and charging them money for it, like Nestle does, or other, these other companies that are moving in and taking over our natural water supplies and making it their own. So reducing waste is one. Stop diverting to biofuels is number 2. There are other ways to produce electricity. There are other ways to burn, we need to use the corn and the land, arable farmland, for farming food that we can use. Biofuels are great, but maybe we'd be better off using algae and some of these other methods that can be grown, kind of guerrilla style. Number 3 is reducing taxes and changing the way that we operate on to support the small farms, to at all costs make sure that the farmers are getting what they're worth, but also supporting smaller farms so we don't have these massive monoculture issues. Number 4 would be to give incentives to small farms and to people who will want to farm. We already have these programs, of course, but we don't seem to take it seriously enough. And right now, like in California, there was an article the other day that that they left something like 1.3 million pounds of food to rot, and everybody was blaming the Trump policies for it. The story was only half true. These things are years in the making. It's true, there weren't enough people who wanted to work in the fields to harvest the food. But you can't blame any administration. You just have to blame the fact that people need more for their work, and it's harder to find workers that will actually go out and pick these. So literally, food is rotting because nobody's there to harvest it, and that's an issue too. Maybe we need to figure that one out. The next one is to allow guerrilla gardening in local areas. This is a huge one for some people. There are city ordinances that do not allow you to grow gardens in your front yard in a lot of places, and neighborhood organizations, you know. I mean, maybe some of these homeowner associations should get together and say, hey, if we really care about, you know, we're going to pretend like we care about our community and our environment, shouldn't we want to feed ourselves? And some of these shared backyard areas should turn into gardens that can be, you know, maintained by the communities that live with them. And we already see this happening, all types of community gardens within parks and whatnot. But guerrilla gardening is often illegal, which means you go into an empty lot somewhere where nobody's using it and you turn it into food, you know. And they're doing this a lot more in urban areas down in California, Oakland, LA, and it will catch on when people realize that we all have to put our, you know, if every one of us even grew a small garden, it would ease the burden on the food supply. That would, you know, I don't know how that would turn out. It's still not going to solve the problem of getting food to people who need it, but at least we're preparing for a future where we don't have to spend so much on shipping and transporting all these things. The last two, the one would be support and educate on personal gardens, which I kind of just mentioned. Show the community, you know, why it's important. Put more energy into that. But the last one, which I'm not going to go into detail, is eat less meat, which is very obvious, and it would be number one. But I wanted to say there's a little bit to be said about these various enzymes that we get from meat protein, and the idea that people are growing artificial meat now in labs. I'm not here to support or to say or to dismiss it. I think that it's a fascinating idea. You know, I always think back to the Matrix when they're eating that, you know, enzyme slop soup, whatever they have. It's like, oh, it's got all the nutrients you need to survive, but people want more than that, you know. We want flavor, and so, but the thing is, if we had some sort, you know, I don't know if synthetic foods are going to be a big thing in the future or not. My belief is that we need to do our best to get all of these from plants naturally, but it is something to consider. It's an interesting aspect of it. I don't really know what else to say about that one. So those are just my thoughts on feeding the world. You know, it's almost a ridiculous thing to talk about because, you know, all the way back, you know, from when I was a kid in the 80s, and they'd have these, you know, save the children and feed the world, and there'd be these, you know, pledges and call-in things, and then these all these places to donate, and, you know, these nonprofits that are trying to help people get food, and there has been a lot of progress. The thing is, along with the progress, there have become a lot more people, and a lot more areas which people are migrating out of. What we have today might disappear. Some of the best farmland is close to, you know, where most people live and farm is often near the sea or a ways inland. As the weather begins to change, as these climates change, and if the sea levels do rise, we're going to end up with less and less farmland, but also more and more inundated cities. We can already see what's happening, and I've been watching it since I was, you know, when I read some conspiracy books when I was younger, or kind of doomsayer books that were saying, hey, by the time, you know, in the 2020, 2030, we're going to start seeing more famine, more water wars, more drought, and here we are, now we're living through it. And I'd just like to see a future for my children where we're not just ignoring it and putting it off onto the next generation and saying, well, we'll figure it out when the time comes, because the time is always here. And the time is now. So, hope you all have a good day, and I hope you are fed. I'm getting kind of hungry myself now, so it almost makes me feel guilty knowing that there's people out there who can't. So anyhow, I'll talk to you all later, and be well.